Good day. There's, over the last couple of days, been a succession of very remarkable calls initiated, it seems, by the United States with China and Ukraine, and one initiated by France with Russia. In the case of the calls initiated by the United States, the first was to the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang and was conducted on the American side by Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and the second, the one between the United States and Ukraine, was between President Biden himself and Ukrainian President Zelensky. Now, the last call, the call between France and Russia, was between President Macron of France and President Putin of Russia. Of the three calls, by the way, the last, the one between Macron and Putin, seems to have been by far the most temperate. The other two calls, the ones between Blinken and Wang and the one between Biden and Zelensky, seem to have erupted in both cases into furious rows. Now, I'm going to, in this program today, focus on the call between Blinken and Wang There's much to say about the other call, the one between Biden and Zelensky, but in order to give it justice, I will cover it in a separate video, which I shall do shortly. And then I'm afraid I'm going to have to turn to the Macron-Putin call, which might perhaps ultimately be the most productive of the three, and over the course of it in a different program, I'm also going to discuss some important polling data which is coming out of Ukraine, which calls into question the whole partisan war hypothesis which we've been hearing so much about. So let's now turn to this important telephone call, this conversation between Wang and Blinken. And it was the United States that initiated the call. And that, of course, immediately begs the question of why they did so. Well, the argument, the explanation that's circulating in Washington is that the United States called Beijing in order to try to get Beijing to exercise its influence over Moscow to restrain Russia from launching this invasion of Ukraine that the Russians deny they have any intention of launching, and which the Ukrainians deny the Russians have any intention of launching. Already extremely bizarre and extremely strange. Now, why, if the actual explanation for Blinken calling Wang makes little sense on its face, why then did Blinken call Wang Well, unquestionably, the United States is always probing to find cracks between China and Russia, and no doubt Blinken was trying to impress on Wang that if there was a war between Russia and Ukraine and the United States was obliged to impose sanctions, then China would be affected by the economic fallout. That is unquestionably the case. Because the Chinese know that already. They're perfectly well aware of what would happen if there was a sanctions war between Russia and the West, and they're well aware of the effect of this upon their own economy. So Blinken would not have been telling the Chinese anything that the Chinese don't already know. And that again begs the question of what Blinken thought he was going to achieve by this call. Because, of course, if the Chinese are already aware that a crisis between the United States and Russia, leading to the kind of sanctions that have been talked about, would affect their economy, was it possibly that Blinken was looking to create cracks between the Chinese and the Russians, or perhaps explore whether those cracks between the Chinese and the Russians even exist? Well, that's one possibility. But I'm going to say straight away that the whole tone of the conversation, everything we know about it, suggests a telephone call made in a state of alarm and some panic, with the United States eager to try and find out what China's intentions are, and all this talk about the United States hoping that China will act as a moderating influence on Russia being essentially ex post facto rationalizations. Now, I make no apology for what I'm now going to do. I'm going to completely disregard the State Department's readout of this telephone call. As far as I can see, it doesn't depart from the usual standard cliches and talking points that the United States always indulges in. I'm going to go to what the Chinese have said about this call. Now, I want to make it absolutely clear when I do so that when I prefer Chinese and Russian statements and readouts about conversations Chinese and Russian officials have with the United States, I am not assuming in any way that those readouts are fully reliable. In this case, and this is a case in point, the Chinese have not actually provided a readout. Remarkably, the Foreign Ministry website has not provided a full, proper readout of the call between Wang Yi and Blinken. A further sign, by the way, that the conversation between Wang Yi and Blinken was not merely heated, but amounted to an all-out row, with the result that the Chinese don't want to highlight the fact in a readout in case this escalates tensions even further. What the Chinese have provided instead is a Foreign Ministry statement which has been circulated by Chinese embassies around the world in a way that is clearly intended to draw the maximum amount of attention to this statement and to inform all governments of it, and also obviously in a way with the intention of trying to moderate some of the fallout from what was clearly a furious row. But to come to my point about reliability, it's essential to understand that there is a difference between a statement that is more informative than another statement and a statement that is more reliable than another statement. For the record, I consider reliability and informativeness to be completely distinct things. A summary of a conversation may be informative, if not reliable. I also think that readouts provided by the United States, as a general rule, are not very informative or very reliable, whereas I consider Chinese and Russian readouts and statements of conversations to be extremely informative, though requiring careful parsing, and reasonably, though not always fully, reliable. Anyway, having explained all of this, and having explained why I'm going to disregard what the White House, or rather what the State Department, is saying about this call, I'm going to go directly to this Chinese statement, a statement which, as I have said, was circulated by the Chinese authorities to all through all their embassies, and specifically, I'm taking the particular statement. I'm taking the text of this statement from the text provided by the mission of the People's Republic of China to the European Union. And this is how it reads. On January 27th, 2022, State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a phone conversation with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the latter's request. Now, note that the Chinese have immediately made it clear at the start of this statement, read out, call it what you like, that it was the Americans who initiated the call. I've discussed in many previous programs how important in protocol terms that is. The fact that a official readout makes clear that it is the other side that has initiated the call already makes the other side, in this case the United States, look like the supplicant. Anyway, To continue, Wang Yi said the most important task for China and the United States at present is to follow through on the important consensus reached by President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden during their virtual meeting last November. During the meeting, President Xi Jinping summarized the experience and lessons learned in China-US interactions over more than half a century and clearly put forward the three principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation, charting the course for the sound development of China-US relations. President Biden responded positively, saying that the United States does not seek a new Cold War, does not seek to change China's system, does not seek to act against China by revitalizing its alliances, does not support Taiwan independence. The words Taiwan independence in the Chinese statement are put in quotation marks, and has no intention to have a conflict or confrontation with China, thus sending a positive message in contrast to the previous administration. However, what the world has seen is that there has been no substantive change in the keynote of the US side's China policy, and President Biden's stated position has not been fully implemented. The US side is still sticking with erroneous words and deeds related to China, which have dealt a new blow to bilateral relations. Wang Yi said this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Shanghai Communique. That's the communique, by the way, between Nixon and Zhou Enlai, which was agreed over the course of Nixon's famous visit to China in 1972. The fact that neither China nor the United States has the intention to change the other is a prerequisite for the normalization of bilateral relations and should also serve as a guarantee for peaceful coexistence between China and the United States in the future. Now, I should say that the expression peaceful coexistence has a Soviet origin. It actually originates in certain statements made by Lenin in the early 1920s, in which Lenin forswore a program, or appeared to forswear a program of revolutionary crusade across Europe, of the Soviet Union, the embryonic Soviet Union as it then was, exporting its revolution across Europe and indeed the world. Instead, Lenin spoke about the need for a peaceful coexistence, or actually the words he used were peaceful cohabitation of planet Earth between the two ideological systems. So the Chinese, Marxist-Leninists as they are reviving that particular Leninist terminology from the 1920s. One, by the way, which was revived by the Soviet Union during the Khrushchev era of the 1950s. To continue, the post-pandemic world will face new situations and challenges, but competition between major countries is not the theme of the world, nor will it solve the problems faced by the United States and other countries. As the world's two top economies and permanent members of the Security Council, China and the United States should bear in mind the two people's fundamental interests, follow the trend of world development, and properly implement the important consensus between the two heads of state. Both sides must grasp the general direction of China-US relations, live up to their commitments by concrete actions, expand the positive aspects of cooperation between the two countries, and control and manage differences in a constructive manner. Wang Yi stressed pressure will only make the Chinese people more united, and confrontation will not stop China from becoming stronger. The burning issue is that the United States should stop interfering with the Olympic Winter Games Beijing 2022, stop playing fire on the Taiwan issue, and stop creating various anti-China small cliques. And then we have the Chinese take on what Blinken Blinken said in response. Blinken said that it is important for foreign ministers of the two countries to have regular communication, stressing that there is no change in President Biden's stated position during the meeting between the two heads of state. The United States and China have both overlapping interests and differences, and the United States is ready to manage and control differences in a reasonable manner. The United States' one China policy remains unchanged. We know that isn't true, by the way. I've done recent programs about this, and a particular program that I did was one in the Financial, touching on an article which appeared in the Financial Times following certain submissions made to Congress in congressional hearings by US military leaders, in which the whole idea of Taiwan being a floating aircraft carrier dominating the Pacific, which should be denied to Beijing, an idea first broached by General MacArthur in the early 1950s. That particular idea has been apparently revived. Anyway, there we go. The United States will cheer for its athletes participating in the Olympic Winter Games Beijing 2022 and wishes the Chinese people a happy spring festival. And then we get to the nub of the issue. Blinken briefed Wang Yi on the US position on the Ukrainian issue, among others. Wang Yi said, to solve the Ukrainian issue, it is still necessary to return to the new Minsk agreement. That's the Minsk agreement of 2015. There was an earlier Minsk agreement reached in 2014, September 2014, which has been superseded. The new Minsk agreement, endorsed by the UN Security Council, is a basic political document recognized by all parties and should be implemented earnestly. China will support any effort that conforms to the direction and spirit of this agreement. At the same time, we call on all parties to remain calm and refrain from inflaming tensions or hyping up the crisis. Wang Yi stressed the security of one country should not be at the expense of the security of others, and regional security should not be guaranteed by strengthening or even expanding military blocs. Today, in the 21st century, all parties should completely abandon the Cold War mentality and form a balanced, effective and sustainable European security mechanism through negotiations, with Russia's legitimate security concerns being taken seriously and addressed. So, a ferocious statement which I suspect waters down an even more ferocious telephone conversation. It shows Wang Yi in an absolutely furious mood, and as we shall see, Wang Yi reflecting very clearly the opinions here of the Chinese government. And we see certain important observations floating up to the surface. We see Wang Yi complaining that President Biden made all kinds of commitments when he spoke to Xi Jinping over the course of this virtual summit that would appear to work towards a better relationship between the United States and China. And of course, the same thing, by the way, happened in the last virtual summit meeting between Biden and Putin. Putin talked about the fact that Russia has legitimate security interests, and it was at that point that Biden said that he would welcome Putin putting in writing what the Russians' concerns were. So we see that in both cases, in the interactions both with the Chinese and with the Russians, Biden, perhaps not fully grasping the relevance of what he was doing, made all sorts of conciliatory noises, first to the Chinese and then to the Russians. And then, as Wang Yi makes clear, and as the Russians have also made clear, the US officials, the US bureaucracy, first and foremost the State Department bureaucracy, have walked back all of the conciliatory moves or indications that Biden made. And it's set out in the clearest possible way by Wang Yi in this conversation, and the fact that there is clearly a difference between what Biden says, in this case to China, and what the United States is actually doing. And to quote Wang Yi's words, President Biden's stated position has not been fully implemented. The US is still sticking with erroneous words and deeds related to China, which have dealt a new blow to bilateral relations. And then, according to this Chinese statement, Wang Yi absolutely let rip. He went for Blinken like a hammer striking a nail. It comes across as absolutely brutal. He talks about the United States operating an anti-China policy, carrying out all kinds of errors in the way it conducts its policy, and he warns Blinken that if the United States continues in this way, this will, and I quote again Wang Yi's words, only make the Chinese people more united, and confrontation will not stop China from becoming stronger. And in particular, Wang Yi seems to have criticized or indeed shredded Blinken over this subterranean campaign against the Winter Olympics in Beijing that the United States has been conducting. And it seems that he extracted from Blinken, or that a rather shaken Blinken seems to have reassured Wang Yi that the United States does not have any plans or intentions or project to interfere or disrupt those Winter Olympic Games. And undoubtedly, I strongly suspect that what has particularly angered the Chinese and why they brought up this question of the Winter Olympics is that disastrous comment, that disastrous story floated by a diplomat in Beijing, almost certainly, by the way, an American diplomat in Beijing, that Xi Jinping had asked Putin to hold back from launching an invasion against Ukraine until the Beijing Winter Olympics were over. The Chinese were absolutely incandescent about that story. I've no doubt that they believe that the diplomat who floated that story, who circulated that story, is American, and it has clearly touched a raw nerve with the Chinese reiterating repeatedly that no such conversation between Xi Jinping and Putin and no such request from the Chinese side to the Russian was ever made, that the whole story is fake news and is part of a disinformation campaign conducted by the United States. So we have the Wang Yi in furious mood. But then, of course, we come back to the situation in Ukraine. And what Blinken found is that Wang Yi came down four square behind the Russians. The problem is that the Minsk agreement has not been fully implemented. The Russians are absolutely right when they say that the fundamental principle is that the security of one country should not be at the expense of the security of others. Wang Yi is in effect repeating and endorsing Russian talking points, comments made by Lavrov, Ryabkov, Putin, any number of others. And he then goes, Wang Yi then goes on to say, regional security should not be guaranteed by strengthening or even expanding military blocs. And that clearly says that the whole problem, the whole crisis in Europe over Ukraine is not about any plan by the Russians to invade Ukraine. It is this relentless expansion of NATO, a military bloc if ever there was one, and that pushing this policy of expanding military blocs is in fact a cause of crisis and a cause of instability and tension. And then Wang Yi goes on to say that in the 21st century, all parties should completely abandon the Cold War mentality and form a balanced, effective and sustainable security mechanism through negotiations, with Russia's legitimate security concerns being taken seriously and addressed. So, in other words, the way out of this crisis is for the United States to get off this high horse that is clambered onto, to stop talking about the right of NATO to expand indefinitely, and sit down and talk with the Russians and address Russia's legitimate security concerns, which by implication, and this is again, we come back to Wang Yi, should take a route that does not follow the project of strengthening or even expanding military blocs. So an absolutely shredding of Blinken by Wang Yi. And if anybody thinks that this is just my take, we see more comments now from the Chinese. And there's been a particularly powerful article in Global Times by Hu Xijin, who is the editor of Global Times and is therefore someone who one can assume is fairly close to Chinese thinking on this issue. And Hu Xijin provides the title to his article is, "If the US provokes China or Russia, the other won't be indifferent." And this is what Hu Xijin had to say. Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi on January 27th had a phone conversation with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the latter's request. Judging from the briefings from both sides and various comments, Wang overwhelmed Blinken. That's what the Chinese say, that Blinken was overwhelmed by Wang Yi. The initial statement released by the US did not mention so-called human rights, Hong Kong or that Western province, whilst the statement issued by China showed that Wang criticized the US for still sticking with erroneous words and deeds related to China and demanded that the US should stop interfering in the Olympic Winter Games, Beijing 2022, stop playing with fire on the Taiwan question, and stop creating various anti-China small cliques. The Ukraine crisis appeared to be the focus of the conversation. Wang called on all parties to remain calm and pointed out that Russia's legitimate security concerns should be taken seriously and addressed. This sentence has been widely quoted by US and Western media as if a rare nerve was touched. They believe it's a symbol of deepening relations between China and Russia. But doesn't Russia have legitimate security concerns in East Europe? As far as I'm concerned, this is Hu Xijin speaking, the Ukraine crisis contains two aspects. First, Russia-Ukraine dispute. Second, a serious confrontation among all relevant parties caused by the US and NATO's strategic suppression of Russia. The eastward expansion of NATO is so unnerving to Russia, almost pushing Moscow into a corner. Russia demanded that NATO, which is hostile to Moscow, not absorb former Soviet Republic Ukraine and not deploy troops on Russia's border. This request is within reason. The US is strategically squeezing China and Russia at the same time. It's arrogant. It is pushing China and Russia together to strike back. Russia has suffered more pressure from the US. However, how it will resolve disputes with Ukraine is one thing. But when it comes to resisting a US crackdown, and that clearly refers to the US threat of sanctions, Russia is not alone. Most of the Chinese people will support it and are willing to see the Chinese government assist Russia in this respect. In other words, if the US imposes sanctions on Russia, China will act to mitigate them. Because we know well that if Russia is crushed by the US, this will bring no good to China at all. And that's the key sentence. China needs Russia just as Russia needs China. The two stand or fall together. They're being pressured by the United States. They will not allow the United States to divide them. And besides, on this Ukrainian issue, the specific Ukrainian issue, and on the issue of NATO expansion, as Wang Yi also told Blinken, the Russians are completely in the right. And then to continue with what Hu Xijin goes on to say, China and Russia have a comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination. They are not empty words. Given a back-to-back, those are Hu Xijin's words, relationship between China and Russia, the United States cannot do anything with the two great powers. That Russia and China are not allies, but better than allies, has become an official statement. Let Americans carefully mull over the connotation of this expression. If it provokes either China or Russia, the other will not be indifferent. Washington should expect this in the future. And we've also, by the way, got an editorial from Global Times which goes into more details about some of the things that have been underway. And I won't read it all, but it makes the following point, that the US itself should put out the fire it set in Ukraine. And it then touches on some comments that Victoria Nuland said on Thursday about how Beijing should use its influence with Moscow to urge a diplomatic solution. And some words by Nuland which the Chinese have taken serious umbrage with and appear to find threatening. And then the article goes on to say, Washington is trying to create such a public opinion impression that the US is working hard to alleviate the crisis. It wants to kick the ball to Russia and China, making them bear the responsibility while shaping the US as a good man. After Washington set a fire in Ukraine, it has pretended to be a victim and imagines China to persuade Russia to put it out. It must be pointed out that Washington is blowing smoke to reverse the cause and the effect. The root cause of the Ukraine issue is that the US has promoted NATO's eastern expansion unrestrainedly, thus pushing Russia into a corner where there is no way to retreat. Washington is the culprit of the crisis. The US now hopes China will persuade Russia. In essence, it wants China to urge Moscow to make a concession. The perfect plan Washington desires is that Moscow will cooperate unconditionally with the US's geopolitical ambitions. How absurd and ridiculous its logic is. Washington is the root cause for many regional crises aside from the Ukrainian issue. And then it the editorial ticks off references to the Korean nuclear crisis, the Iran issue, Afghanistan, and the rest. And then the editorial goes on to say, When the US messes up a region and finds itself unable to clean up the situation, it hopes to draw other countries into paying for these mistakes. In recent years, Washington has expected China's participation in the resolution of almost all major international crises. On the one hand, it has done its utmost to crack down on China, and on the other, it has had the temerity to seek China's help. This is the case this time. The US is carrying out strategic suppression on China in the Asia-Pacific region, as it is doing with Russia, whilst at the same time it hopes China will urge Russia to make a concession. It hopes to take all the benefits while doing bad things. When handling regional conflicts, the biggest difference between China and the US is that China seeks peaceful solutions, but the United States seeks chaos. China has never kidnapped the collective interests of a region for its own interests, but instead has always taken a responsible attitude and looked for a solution based on facts. China has never shied away from making mediation efforts within its capacity. It doesn't choose to act or not act simply because it has a good relationship or a competition with some other country. China has pursued an independent foreign policy and always respects other countries' independence. It makes active efforts to push relevant parties to return to the negotiating table and take care of all parties' security concerns to find the greatest common ground in complicated situations. From our point of view, to ease tensions in Ukraine, it is the United States that has the most room for action. Washington should first stop making provocations in the region and let Europe solve its own security problems. While rejecting Russia's legitimate concerns on the issue of NATO's eastward expansion, the US continues to step up efforts to create tension, withdrawing US diplomats in Ukraine and continuing to send weapons to Ukraine. Because Germany refused to be the follower of the US this time, American opinion accused it of being a traitor to the West. The US clearly sees itself as the plenipotentiary of Europe. After the end of the Second World War, the United States and the West have been unrestrainedly emphasizing and expanding so-called collective defense, even at the cost of global strategic stability. However, it turns out that the more they pursue collective defense, the more the safety of members outside the small circles is damaged, and the more they have to strengthen their own security. Consequently, the US and the West have fallen into a curse of the safer they want to be, the less safe they are, which has caused crises one after another. If Washington's ultra-strategic selfishness remains unrestrained, that even if the Ukraine crisis reaches a soft landing, the next crisis awaits. To solve the Ukraine crisis, if we are to play a mediation role, we would like to advise Washington that whoever hung the bell on the tiger's neck must untie it. It should give up the zero-sum game and the Cold War mentality as soon as possible and use the correct method to put out the fire it set. So there we are. A call by the Americans, possibly to try to get the Chinese to influence the Russians into making concessions. Possibly, that's what the US says. Or perhaps to try to create cracks between the Chinese and the Russians. More plausible. Or perhaps because the US got unnerved and worried when the Russians indicated that they were going to consult with the Chinese over their next response to the US's replies to the various draft proposals the Russians have made. By the way, I think that is a strong possibility. But whatever the reason, whatever the purpose of this call, its effect has been to solidify and make public China's full square support for Russia in this confrontation with NATO and the Western powers, and over the specific issue of Ukraine. And we see a clear comment that China not only stands ready to support Russia, but if the United States starts to impose sanctions upon Russia along the lines indicated, then China will move immediately to support Russia in that kind of sanctions war, with the Russians doing reciprocally for the Chinese if they ever find themselves under similar or identical pressures. So a disastrous call from Blinken to Wang Yi, one which it would have been much better if the United States had never made. It's incomprehensible, actually, that the US should take a step like this, given the closeness of the Chinese and the Russians to each other. Taking a step like this has merely angered the Chinese even further, but also given the Chinese those grounds, those reasons to set out clearly their view and perspective of the entire crisis in Europe, this artificial crisis that has been whipped up by the United States over the last few months over a threat by Russia to invade Ukraine, which Ukraine itself insists does not exist. Well, I am not at all clear what the United States honestly believes it is doing in this situation. So far, the sum total of what has been achieved over the course of this crisis is that relations between the United States and Ukraine are the worst they have been ever since the Maidan coup of 2014. I'm going to discuss all of that in my next video. They've also weakened and destabilized Ukraine itself and its economy at a time when the United States pretends to be acting to support Ukraine. And on top of that, it is sowing increasing doubts and concerns about US policy amongst the US's key NATO allies, amongst the Germans, who have been the subject of an extraordinary campaign of vilification, as this Global Times editorial has indicated, amongst the French, who are making no attempt to conceal their skepticism about this whole issue, and amongst other European countries also, with countries like Croatia, or at least important political leaders in Croatia, Bulgaria, and one suspects an increasing number of other countries starting to speak quite openly of their fundamental misgivings and doubts about the whole direction of US policy. I am completely at a loss to understand what exactly it is that the United States is looking to achieve through all of this. If it wants to impose these sanctions from hell on the Russians, which seems to be its particular anxiety at the moment, all it is going to achieve is expose its own bluff and the ineffectiveness of the sanctions that have been talked about. I've done a long program about this. There's subsequently been a further article, a detailed article about the sanctions, which has appeared in the Daily Telegraph, written by Ambrose Evans Pritchard, which I'm considering doing a video about, which will appear on our Locals platform. So you can see that this whole situation, it seems to me, utterly misguided. It makes absolutely no sense what the direction of US policy is. And I do ask myself, I do wonder what exactly it is that these people, Blinken, Nuland, and the rest, think they are achieving as a result of maintaining this crisis at the moment. I'm going to give the United States some unsolicited advice. I'm not, of course, assuming that anybody in authority in the United States follows this channel. But I'm going to say what I think that the United States needs to do. I think it needs to switch off this constant inflammatory commentary about a Russian invasion. This isn't doing any good. I don't think it's helping the situation at all. I think this whole story needs to be dialed down as much as possible. I say that because over the last couple of hours, there have been again more attempts to inflame it with threats against the Russian ambassador in Washington, talk that he might be effectively forced out of the country in April by having his visa withdrawn. And one gets the impression that, and also with further stories like a wild one today that I've just heard today about the fact that some anonymous officials have told Reuters that they've seen that the Russians are deploying medical people with their forces in eastern Ukraine, presumably in preparation for this mythological invasion. So all of that needs to be dialed down. The United States need to stop talking about NATO's eastward expansion, and it needs a period of silence to let this whole thing calm down. Then after that period of silence is past, perhaps it can tiptoe round and start looking to see what it can do with respect to these Russian demands for formal treaties. The United States can't accept those at the moment, so I would have thought the best thing for the United States to do is to say as least as possible about this subject and to let the whole tension in Europe dial down, whilst at the same time letting the French and the Germans push ahead with trying to achieve that internal settlement of Ukraine through the Normandy 4 summit, the Normandy 4 process. The indications are that for the first time, the French especially, and the Germans possibly, may be doing what must be done to get that Normandy 4 process, that process of negotiation set out in the Minsk agreement, finally and properly underway. So I think what we need from the United States at this time is a period of silence. Agitated and hysterical telephone calls to the Chinese foreign minister, which elicit this kind of reaction, don't seem to me to be a good idea at all. All they are doing is achieving the opposite effect of the one that the United States presumably wants to achieve. And I would say that if the United States is going to try and leverage this crisis to extend any sanctions it imposes on Russia onto China, then the European countries like Germany and France, which do massive trade with China, are going to be extremely concerned and probably very angry, and perhaps will be forced into making public statements of a sort that the United States might not like, even as they put a spoke in the whole process. So a period of calm, of quiet, of calm reflection, and of quieter words. Silence is golden. The United States needs that advice. People with loud mouths in the United States needs to start to shut them. Whether they're, of course, listening to my advice is an entirely different matter. Whether they're paying any attention to it, if they do listen to it, is another matter again. But that, for the record, is my view. And in the meantime, if they're not prepared to listen to me, then perhaps they should listen instead to a far more important, far more powerful man than I can ever conceivably be, the State Councillor and Foreign Minister of the People's Republic of China, one of the most powerful diplomats in the world, Wang. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs on this channel. And also please remember to check out our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Also, please remember to look up Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video, and you can also find a great deal of exclusive content which we publish on our locals channel, on our locals platform, which you can find links under this video for also. And just to remind you, I do live streams on locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. You are welcome to join me then if you wish. And in addition, if you want, you can find us on multiple other platforms as well: BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, SuperU. There is also we also now have our own television channel where you can see all our videos back to back. You can find links to that as well. And of course, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy yourself a famous Duran magic mug and hoodie and sweatshirt and t-shirt and all those amazing things. And of course, if you like this video, please remember to press the like button to this video and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day. Until then.